Yes. It's all the same. Oh my gosh. I'm feeling like, you know, I know I could do it, but I just am second guessing a little bit. Oh, why? You know, just I don't want to, like, I'm just, I don't want to, you know, but I also want to get others, like I don't. This is it.
And this is the first time doing it, yeah, I'm not there, he's like.
No.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started with our last presentation then. So I would like to introduce Mariah, who will be speaking about the relationship between breastfeeding and type 1 diabetes. So if you would like to help me welcome her.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm excited to share the relationship between breastfeeding and type 1 diabetes that I found. All right, so just an overview of my study. I'm going to start out by just making a connection between my topic and my own experiences. And then I'm also just going to dive into what type 1 diabetes is, and then also just going over what some breast milk content and why it may have some protective properties. And then also just looking at some MNT review research articles. All right, so to start off, I got interested in this topic my spring semester of senior year, so that was like last spring. I had to take an endocrinology class, and for our last final presentation, we could pick our kind of own project, and my group picked a book study, and we looked at gut feelings, the microbiome, and our health. So this book went through basically, so kind of connected with Kristen's topic, but looked at all the ways the gut kind of affects our life, specifically starting out in the birth neonatal phase. So it looked at whether it was a vaginal birth versus C-section that affects it, whether it was breastfed versus formula, that'll affect it too. So that's where my interest kind of stemmed from. And then I also made this connection. My first rotation was at a WIC clinic for my internship, and this was right around when we were kind of picking topics for this presentation, and the connection of the endocrinology class and then also just the WIC experience kind of brought my research to this. At the WIC clinic, they support formula and breast milk, so whatever the mother chooses, they'll give support in either, but they really promote the breastfeeding because of some of the protective properties they know it has. So just to start out, just going through, I'm sure we all kind of know the basis of type 1, but I think it's important to kind of reassess that. It's an autoimmune disease, so the body's beta cells in the pancreas aren't producing any insulin. It's typically diagnosed at a young age, and then some factors that are associated with the onset is genetics, epigenetics, environmental factors, so some multifactorial things, so there's a lot that plays into it. Some symptoms would be frequent urination, so often when the child wets the bed a lot at night, it might be a sign of type 1. Also, always thirsty, fatigue, and hunger are also some signs. And then just some treatments and nutritional implications. A combination of insulin, medical nutrition therapy, and exercise may be important to help control this disease. And then nutritionally, just using the diet to help control blood sugars. So looking at the carbohydrates and how they affect the blood sugars the most. Then utilizing carb counting and fixed regimens to kind of stay on that consistent carb intake. And then just looking at some of the protective factors that breast milk might have. So studies show that breast milk has immunoglobulins to increase the immunological function for the infant, and just some anti-pathogenic and anti-inflammatory properties. It also leads to more diversity and stability in the gut microbiome. So these are just some of the protective factors, along with the emotional benefits and kind of that connection too, so multi-factors. So the first study that I found was perinatal and neonatal determinants of childhood type 1 diabetes. All my studies today are pretty observational because it might not be ethical to tell a mother exactly how to feed their child. So that's just one of the downfalls of all my studies today, is that it's observational, looking at the effects, but I think there is some important results that come out of the research as well. So for the first one, the objective was to identify environmental factors that exert their effect in the perinatal and neonatal period and influence the subsequent onset of insulin dependent, which is type 1 diabetes during childhood. So to do this, they used 196 cases, so those were children that were diagnosed with type 1, and then 325 controls, so there was no type 1 diagnosis. And then the methods, they collected determinants of risk data using hospital records and midwife notes. And then the results was exclusive initial breastfeeding seems to decrease the risk of type 1 diabetes. And this study was done like early 2000, 1999, so it's an older study, but I think it was kind of important to look at the only two statistically significant findings, or what was that initial exclusive breastfeeding was protective against the onset of type 1, and neonatal illnesses were more likely to develop type 1 later. So kind of that attack at the immune system right away when they were babies kind of also had a factor for that. And then I wanted to look at kind of to wrap up the whole summary, I found this quote that helped me put the whole study together. So the pathogenic process of autoimmune B cell destruction may well be initiated in utero or around the time of birth, when the developing fetus and neonate are particularly vulnerable and the immune system remains immature. So again, that attack at the immune system right away with the illness or the breastfeeding to kind of build up that system is very statistically significant. And then for this study, I gave it a neutral just because it was older, and I know there's more research out there now. The strengths is that there were little opportunity for biases because they really went off the hospitalization records. So there wasn't like recall bias from what the mothers kind of said they did years ago. The data was from reliable collection methods like those hospital records. Small drop rates due to not finding a match. So to explain this part a little more, each case, so the person that was diagnosed with type 1 were paired up with two controls who did not have type 1. They were matched based on age and sex, and then that's how they did their comparisons in each group. So the dropout rates were just due to someone not finding a match. So if there wasn't anyone same age or sex, they weren't included in the study. And then the results were also clearly defined. So it was a really easy read for the research study, I thought. And then the weaknesses is that it was a case control study. So it was a lower grading and it was outdating. And then the end wrap up was confusing. There wasn't much information. So even though the results were clearly defined, the way they got to the results were a little confusing for me. And then I wanted to look at a more recent study. So we have the infant feeding and risk of type 1 diabetes in 2 large Scandinavian birth cohorts. So in this study, the objective was to study the relationship between the duration of full and any breastfeeding and the risk of type 1 diabetes. For this, they used over 155,000 children. Both cohorts, there was one from Norway, so the Norwegian mother and child cohort study, and then also Denmark, so the Danish national birth cohort. So they kind of used both these groups to do some comparisons. The methods, they used 2 different cohorts of children that were either born anywhere between 1996 and 2009. They analyzed the data and followed participants until 2014 for the Denmark study, and then or 2015 for the Norway study. And then they reported eating habits at 6 months and 18 months. And the results showed that there is a 2-fold increased risk for developing type 1 diabetes if the baby is never exposed to breast milk compared to those who are exposed to any or fully breastfed. So this study was interesting that it kind of showed that there's not a difference in exclusively fully breastfeeding for a longer period of time. It really is pushing the importance of any exposure to breastfeeding or breast milk will decrease your risk of type 1 diabetes. So that's kind of cool that it doesn't have to be like all or nothing as long as you're introducing a little bit of that. And then this graph just broke down the population that they used for it because the 2 cohorts was the most confusing part for me. So I thought I'd break it down a little bit more for you. So just looking at the live births and then if they were missing data at the 6 months, they took them out, or if they were incomplete, they took them out of the data, and then at the 18 months as well, if they were missing any data in that report, then they would take it out. And then for this one, I gave it a positive, even though it was still one of those observational ones. I thought that the strengths were that it was a fairly recent study. This one was easy to follow and statistical analysis was described very well. And then it looked into multiple factors, like culturally and age of the mother giving birth and just multifactorials that they also looked at. And then weaknesses, again, the observational. And then my last study is infant feeding patterns in families with diabetes history, observation from the environmental determinants of diabetes in the young birth cohort study. So this one, the main objective was just to assess the association between diabetes family history and infant feeding patterns. So kind of to look at the reasons why a mother might choose to breastfeed or not. One of the many reasons. So for this one, there was about 7,000 children used in the study, and the family history was broken down into a couple different ways. So there was a group with mothers with type 1 diabetes. So that one, there was 292 kids included in that. And then mothers with gestational diabetes, and that one had 404 children. And then they also looked at father siblings with type 1 diabetes, but the mother didn't have any type of diabetes. That was 464. And then no family history of diabetes was 5,866. They were going to include if they had extended family with diabetes, but that number was so small that they didn't include that in their study. And then the methods to kind of collect the data, they collected data using the Teddy book, which was just kind of like a place to write down everything that each parent got. And in the 3-month cycles until infants were 24 months old, they kind of looked at a couple different factors. So they looked at duration of breastfeeding, the age that cow's milk was introduced. Then they also looked at age that cereal with gluten started to be consumed. So just looking at ages that things were consumed rather than just ages that breast milk was taken away. And the results showed that exclusively breastfeeding ended sooner in participants of mothers who had type 1 diabetes or gestational diabetes when compared to those with participants with family members without diabetes. And for this study, I again gave it a positive. The weakness, again, is that it was observational. But I thought this one's strengths was that it was fairly recent and they looked at diverse populations to collect the data. So again, different races, different ages, different economical status, different diagnoses. And then I just wanted to put all of them together to kind of look because they were pretty similar, but with their results, but just to pull out the important pieces for each one. So the first study, the peritoneal and the neonatal determinants of childhood type 1s. the overall summary I put in quotes, and then I also put my implications. So I'll read off the quoted results. So neonatal illness is increased and initial breastfeeding decreased the risk of childhood type 1 diabetes. Further determinants of risks are mothers with type 1 diabetes, older mothers, and preeclampsia during pregnancy. For this one, the main point I got out of the study is just because an infant is breastfed does not guarantee that they won't develop type 1 diabetes. There's multiple factors that play a role in this onset, like we looked at the neonatal or infant illnesses. So many things that go into it. So just because an infant is breastfed does not mean it won't have type 1. And then for the second study, the quoted conclusion was that suggestive evidence supports the connection that breastfeeding reduces the risk of type 1 diabetes. Among those who were breastfed, however, no evidence indicated that prolonging full or any breastfeeding was associated with a reduced risk of type 1. I think this is important to encourage mothers to introduce breast milk, small sums of breast milk, even if they don't choose to exclusively breastfeed for a long time. I think just that encouragement of trying any little bit may have great results for the infant. And then for the last one, the last conclusion was family history of diabetes is associated with infant feeding patterns. However, the association clearly differed by country, indicating that cultural differences are important determinants of infant feeding behavior. These findings need to be considered when developing strategies to improve feeding patterns in infants with a diabetes family history. So I had a lot of implications for this one. I thought that even though there are proven benefits for breastfeeding for both the mother and the baby, it is not ethically correct to pressure anyone into a certain way. Even though we know the benefits, there's lots of things that go into that decision. Everyone has different beliefs and cultures that may influence their choices. And then it's always important to encourage and support whatever decision. And then also, again, just looking at a combination of genetics and lifestyle play a role in type 1 diagnosis, and looking at how mothers with type 1 ended breastfeeding earlier. So multiple things that play a role in this decision, even when we know the benefits of one of them. And now it's just time for questions if you have anything. Jenny.
Having gone through a rotation, is that right?
Mhm.
Do kids get tested for blood sugar levels when they're coming in up to 5 years?
Not blood sugar, just iron we test. Yeah. But I'm sure. Yeah, that's true. Yes, ma'am.
So I know you're only really looking for implications with type 1 diabetes, but did you notice in any of the research that they discussed any other diseases or like autoimmune diseases at all?
Not that I saw. They like brought them up, I would say. They just discussed how the gut microbiome may be onset to autoimmune factors. So they briefly said, like, brought up the relationship, but the study didn't go into any